The first scream of her newborn son was swallowed by the sterile hum of the delivery room, but what shattered wasn't her body. It was the fragile illusion of a future she had spent years building. At Chicago Memorial, the fluorescent lights buzzed with a cold, indifferent energy as Alina Vance fought through the final, searing waves of labor. The medical team moved with practiced efficiency around her, their voices a low murmur of encouragement that barely registered. Her knuckles were white, gripping the metal rails of the bed as each contraction ripped through her, a relentless, unforgiving tide. But amidst the physical agony, a different kind of pain was taking root, the hollow ache of an empty doorway. Her husband, Julian, had sworn on everything he valued that he would be by her side. He had looked her in the eye just that morning, promising nothing would keep him away. But the hallway outside remained a silent, accusing void, and Alina realized with chilling clarity that a man's promises could evaporate like mist on a cold window pane. At 12:17 a.m., Leo Vance entered the world, his cry piercing the clinical silence. The tension in the room shifted, a collective exhale of relief. A nurse placed the tiny, trembling bundle on Alina's chest, and for a suspended moment, the world outside ceased to exist. She traced the delicate line of his brow with a trembling finger, tears now streaming freely as she whispered the name she had held close during countless lonely evenings in their high-rise apartment. Leo. A name that represented the steady, unshakable love she still believed in. He was here, warm and real, his tiny fist curling instinctively against her skin, grounding her to something solid as the life she knew began to crumble. She had given birth to a son, and in the same hour, she had watched her marriage die. The door finally swung open, but not with urgency. Julian Carter stepped inside, his posture radiating the confidence of a man who believed the world bent to his will. At 37, he was a vice president at a booming financial firm, a man accustomed to boardroom battles and decisive power plays. His coat was draped perfectly over his shoulders, his hair immaculate, his expression unreadable. He looked less like a new father arriving for a birth and more like a CEO walking into a quarterly review. The faint scent of expensive perfume, floral and unfamiliar, drifted to Alina before he even spoke. It was a scent she didn't own. Her eyes, sharpened by exhaustion and a new, raw awareness, caught the faint trace of dark red lipstick smudged on his collar. "I got here as soon as I could," Julian stated, his voice even devoid of breathlessness or apology. His gaze flickered to the baby for a mere second before dropping to the phone in his hand, its screen glowing in the dim room. His thumb began moving immediately. Alina watched him, a strange calm settling over her. The pain of labor was fading, replaced by a hyper-aware clarity. The nurse beside her glanced at Julian expectantly, waiting for the new father to reach for his child. He didn't. He simply slid the phone back into his pocket, with a soft sigh that reeked of inconvenience. "You missed it," Alina whispered, her voice fragile but steady. It was a statement of fact, not an accusation. "Something came up," Julian replied, his words clipped, professional. The same tone he used when delegating a task to a subordinate. There was no warmth, no awe. Leo shifted against her chest, searching for comfort. Alina held him tighter, a fierce protectiveness surging through her. She looked for a trace of the man she had married in Julian's face, for a glimmer of the shared dream they had built. What she found instead was a vast, unnerving distance. He stepped closer to the crib, peered down for a moment, and muttered something under his breath that she wasn't supposed to hear. This wasn't part of the plan, but she heard, every syllable. The exhaustion had stripped away her illusions, leaving only a brutal, crystalline truth. Then he said the words that would become the hinge on which her entire life would turn. "My real life is waiting." The sentence was soft, almost offhand, as if commenting on the weather, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. The room's temperature seemed to plummet. Alina's heart slammed against her ribs as she stared at him, the father of the child nestled against her. Real life. The implication was a sledgehammer. She and Leo were not it. Julian adjusted his cufflink, a nervous habit she recognized from high-stakes meetings. "You should get some rest," he added, already retreating. "We'll talk later." He didn't touch her. He didn't kiss his son. He didn't stay. The door clicked shut behind him, a soft, final sound that echoed louder than a scream. Alina pressed her lips to Leo's forehead, breathing in his newborn scent as tears slipped silently down her face. Outside the hospital window, the Chicago skyline glittered, a cold, indifferent backdrop to the quiet apocalypse unfolding in one small room. A woman, long underestimated, had just woken up to a truth she could no longer ignore. When Alina returned to their penthouse 3 days later, she knew something was wrong before she even crossed the threshold. The hallway was unnaturally silent, the air thick and heavy, as if the space itself was bracing for impact. She carefully balanced Leo in his car seat while the driver who had driven her home offered a polite farewell, unaware he was leaving her at a place that no longer felt like home. The elevator door slid closed with a soft metallic whisper, sealing her into a corridor of quiet dread. She unlocked the door with trembling hands, her body still recovering, her mind racing. The apartment that greeted her was a museum of perfection. Polished marble counters gleamed under recessed lighting. Furniture was arranged with architectural precision, but there was no evidence that a newborn was meant to live here. No crib in the nursery. No stack of soft blankets waiting. No scent of baby powder or formula. It looked staged, untouched. A showroom, not a home. Alina stepped inside, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood as she carried her son through a space that suddenly felt cavernous and cold. She had imagined bringing Leo home to flowers, to celebration, to a life beginning. Instead, she was walking into a tomb of broken promises. Julian stood by the kitchen island, his back to her, speaking quietly into his phone. He didn't startle when she entered. He didn't rush over. His posture was rigid as he murmured into the receiver, "I told you not to call me here." There was a sharp, impatient edge to his voice. Alina froze in the entryway, Leo's weight against her chest the only thing keeping her upright. She listened. There was a pause, and then his tone changed entirely. It softened. It became intimate. "I miss you too," he said, the words low and warm, a voice she hadn't heard directed at her in over a year. The shift sliced through her more cleanly than any accusation could have. He ended the call abruptly when he finally noticed her standing there. "You're back," he said flatly, slipping the phone into his pocket. His eyes moved to Leo, then away. "How was the discharge?" The question was clinical, detached, like asking about a dry-cleaning pickup. Alina searched his face for a flicker of guilt, of discomfort, of anything. She found only irritation at being caught off guard. She adjusted Leo's blanket and walked past him without a word, heading for the nursery. The door was ajar at the end of the hall. She pushed it open with her foot, her heart constricting at what she saw. The crib they had picked out together during her 7th month was still in pieces. Screws and an instruction manual lay untouched in a plastic bag on the floor. Julian had promised to finish it that weekend. That weekend had come and gone weeks ago. She gently lowered Leo into a portable bassinet she had bought herself at the last minute, her movements slow and deliberate, a quiet act of self-preservation. From the living room, Julian's voice rose again, this time sharp with frustration. "No, you don't understand," he snapped. Then in the next breath, his voice dropped back to that intimate, unrecognizable murmur. Alina stepped back into the hallway unseen. "She's exhausted," Julian was saying, his voice low. "She won't leave, she has nowhere to go." The word hit Alina like a slap, not anger, not confusion. A cold, calculated certainty. He thought she was trapped, dependent, weak. Her fingers dug into the doorframe. "You're my future," Julian continued softly. "Just give me time." The hallway seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Every promise he'd ever made to her echoed in her memory. The late-night conversations about building a family, the whispered dreams of growing old. They sounded hollow now. Rehearsed lines delivered to the wrong audience. She stepped fully into the light, and Julian stiffened. "How long have you been standing there?" he demanded, his voice defensive. "Long enough," she replied, her voice quiet but clear. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Alina, don't make this dramatic. You just had a baby, you're emotional." The dismissal was immediate, practiced. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You need stability. I provide that for you, for him." He gestured vaguely toward the nursery, as if Leo were just another line item on a balance sheet. Alina studied him, a painful clarity settling in. This man didn't fear losing her. He feared the inconvenience of her departure, the exposure. "You don't have anywhere else to go," Julian added, his tone cool and calculating. "Be realistic." Something inside Alina shifted in that moment. It didn't break. It hardened. She looked past him, through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the glittering Chicago skyline. He believed she had no options. He believed she had surrendered herself completely to his world, his name, his power. He had no idea how wrong he was. The truth didn't shatter Aliner's world with noise. It settled into her bones like ice, quiet and irreversible. Morning light filtered through the penthouse windows, casting pale shadows across the kitchen where Aliner had stood holding her son only hours earlier. Now Leo slept in the bassinet, unaware his mother's heart was breaking in slow motion. Julian had already left for work, his departure brisk, unemotional. Fatherhood was simply another appointment he could reschedule. The apartment was unnaturally polished, untouched by the chaos of a newborn. It looked perfect. It felt hollow. Julian's laptop sat half open on the counter, its screen glowing faintly. Aliner had never been one to snoop. She had trusted him through late meetings, unexplained trips, growing distance. But something had shifted in the hospital. A soft notification chimed and her eyes locked onto the name that appeared across the screen. Claire Morrison. Her breath caught. The message preview was short, intimate. "Last night was perfect. I miss you. Our future is worth waiting for." Aliner's pulse pounded as she stepped forward and opened the laptop fully. The thread expanded, revealing weeks of messages layered with affection, planning, and promises never meant for her. There were photos. Julian smiling across candlelit tables. Julian leaning close, his hand on Claire's waist. Julian looking relaxed, alive in a way she hadn't seen in years. Another message appeared. "You'll tell her after the quarter ends, right? She deserves to know. You deserve a real family." The words burned. Real family. The same phrase he'd used in the hospital. Now it was undeniable. Aliner gripped the counter as nausea rose in her throat. Her marriage rearranged itself in her mind with brutal clarity. The distance, the indifference, the way Julian had stopped touching her long before she noticed. The elevator door slid open behind her and Julian walked in moments later, sunglasses on, coffee in hand. His confidence was intact until he saw the open laptop. His posture changed. Irritation. He crossed the room and shut it with a sharp snap. "You had no right," he said, his voice calm but warning. Aliner didn't raise her voice. "Who is she?" He removed his sunglasses slowly, his eyes revealing calculation, not guilt. "You're exhausted. You're making this bigger than it is." He spoke to her like a nervous investor. Aliner's exhaustion vanished beneath a surge of clarity. "I read everything," she said, her tone steady despite the tremor inside her. The silence thickened. Julian exhaled as if deciding if honesty was worth the hassle. "Claire understands me," he said finally. "She fits my life." The words weren't shouted. They were stated. A conclusion reached long ago. Aliner felt the final thread inside her snap quietly. "And what am I?" she asked. Julian didn't hesitate. "You were never meant to be permanent." The cruelty was in the calm certainty. Behind her, Leo stirred, a small, fragile sound. Aliner turned toward her son, and in that movement, something powerful settled inside her. Julian continued speaking, outlining practicality, stability, image. He spoke of timing and strategy as if dismantling a marriage were a corporate restructure. "You will stay," he added. "It's better for everyone." Better for everyone. Aliner looked at him with eyes no longer pleading. He believed she had nowhere to go. He believed his life defined her worth. He believed she would accept humiliation for comfort. What Julian didn't know, what he had never understood, was that the woman he underestimated had been quietly stronger than he imagined for a long time. She was not the one trapped. He was. Decision didn't arrive with drama. It formed slowly, like steel hardening under pressure. That evening, as twilight settled over Chicago, Aliner sat in the nursery with Leo asleep against her chest. Julian had left again, claiming a late dinner with investors. The apartment felt enormous around her, its glass walls reflecting a life built on image, not truth. She looked at the unfinished crib and understood that nothing in this house had been built for permanence. Not the nursery, not the marriage. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "He's with her again tonight. Thought you should know." Aliner stared at the words. The humiliation didn't flare this time. It settled quietly. Confirmation brought clarity. She kissed Leo's forehead and whispered an apology he didn't understand, promising him silently that she would not let this environment shape his understanding of love. She walked into the living room, the baby monitor in her hand. Julian's belongings were scattered on the marble island, cufflinks, his watch, an open briefcase. Everything about his world was calculated, strategic, controlled. Eleanor's gaze moved to the window, the city shimmering below. He believed she would stay because she feared losing comfort. He believed she depended on his income, his name, his status. What he never noticed was that Eleanor had her own reserves. Before she married Julian, she had inherited a trust fund, managed privately in her name alone. She had never flaunted it. She had chosen Julian because she believed he loved her, independent of her wealth. The irony was bitter. He had assumed she brought nothing. He had assumed she was small because she let him feel large. Standing in the center of the polished living room, Eleanor felt that hidden truth steady her breathing. Fear whispered practical questions. Where will you go? What will people say? But another voice answered, anywhere is better than here. She moved into the bedroom and opened the closet. Instead of designer dresses, she reached for comfortable clothes, warm sweaters, and the baby carrier she'd bought herself. She packed only what she could carry: diapers, formula samples, essential documents she had quietly stored in a drawer Julian never opened. Her movements were methodical, as if she'd been unconsciously forming this plan for a long time. She returned to the nursery, stood by the unfinished crib one last time, then lifted Leo gently, securing him against her chest. He stirred, then settled, trusting her without question. That trust fueled her courage. She turned off the nursery light and walked to the front door. She paused, listening to the silence of the apartment one last time. The city glowed beyond the windows, unaware that within this expensive space, an empire of illusion was about to lose its foundation. Eleanor opened the door slowly, the cool hallway air brushing her face. For the first time in days, her breathing felt steady. She wasn't running away. She was walking toward something truer. The elevator doors closed around her, and she understood that Julian's greatest mistake was underestimating the woman he thought he controlled. The night air hit Eleanor's face like a slap, sharp, unfiltered, as she stepped onto the Chicago sidewalk with Leo against her chest. Snow flurries drifted beneath the streetlights, catching in her hair, but she barely noticed the cold. Her body was still weak from childbirth, her steps unsteady, yet her mind was clearer than it had been in months. The glass tower behind her reflected a distorted image of the life she had left, expensive, polished, emotionally bankrupt. She didn't look back. Looking back meant doubt, and doubt was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her phone battery was nearly dead. She had nowhere specific to go. Pride kept her from calling family immediately. Instinct warned her against staying anywhere Julian might search. She walked without direction, letting the city carry her forward. Cars passed in streaks of light. Strangers hurried by. Unaware of the quiet revolution unfolding inside one exhausted young mother. Leo stirred, and Eleanor pressed her cheek to his head, whispering reassurances more for herself than for him. She would not let him grow up in a house where love was conditional and dignity negotiable. Her vision blurred suddenly. Exhaustion, emotional weight, physical strain, it all caught up with her. Her knees weakened near the corner of a quiet street, and for a frightening second the world tilted. Before she could fall, a firm hand caught her elbow. "Eleanor," a familiar voice, startled and concerned. She blinked through the cold and recognized the face leaning toward her. David Chen. He looked older than the last time she'd seen him at a college reunion, but his eyes held the same steady kindness. At 35, David was a cardiologist at Northwestern. Now he stood before her in a heavy coat, scrubs visible beneath it, heading home after a late shift. His gaze moved from her pale face to the baby strapped against her chest, and his concern sharpened. "What happened?" he asked gently. Eleanor opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. Her legs trembled. David didn't press. He stepped closer, wrapping his own coat around her shoulders, shielding Leo as well. "You shouldn't be out here," he said firmly. "Come with me." There was no pity in his voice, only steadiness. Eleanor hesitated for a second, then nodded. Pride could wait. Survival could not. David guided her to his car, opening the passenger door with care. The warmth inside was surreal after the biting wind. As he started the engine, he glanced at her, measuring her pain without asking intrusive questions. He simply drove. His apartment in Lincoln Park was modest compared to the penthouse, but it radiated something more valuable: warmth. A soft lamp illuminated shelves lined with medical journals and photos. The space felt lived in, authentic. David helped her settle on the couch, bringing water and extra blankets without hesitation. Leo stirred but stayed calm, sensing safety. "You're safe here," David said quietly. The words hit Alina harder than Julian's cruelty ever had. She looked around the small apartment and felt the weight in her chest ease for the first time since the hospital. She had left behind wealth, status, illusion. In exchange, she had stepped into uncertainty. Yet sitting there, wrapped in borrowed warmth with her son resting peacefully, she realized something profound. Sometimes safety doesn't come from power or glass towers. Sometimes it comes from the simple presence of someone who chooses compassion without condition. And somewhere across Chicago, Julian still believed she had nowhere else to go. Julian Carter didn't notice the silence at first. When he returned to the penthouse the next morning, irritation was his dominant emotion. He expected Alina in the nursery, exhausted but compliant, waiting for him to dictate the next move. Instead, the apartment greeted him with an unfamiliar stillness. The bassinet was gone. The diaper bag was gone. The closet doors stood open, several hangers empty. For a man accustomed to control, the absence was louder than any confrontation. He moved through the rooms, calling her name, the sharpness in his voice escalating with each unanswered echo. The nursery stopped him cold. The unfinished crib remained in the corner, screws untouched. It looked like evidence now, a silent accusation. He dialed Alina, straight to voicemail, again and again. Each failure tightened something in his chest he refused to call panic. Anger came easier. He paced across the marble floor, replaying their last conversation. She had looked too calm when he told her she would stay. He had mistaken stillness for surrender. He had miscalculated his own wife. He called her family, disguising urgency as concern. "She's unstable," he suggested smoothly. "Postpartum stress, I'm worried." The performance was seamless, but Alina wasn't answering. Meanwhile, his phone vibrated with other tensions. Emails from the office began flooding in, subject lines marked urgent. Julian had authorized several asset transfers in recent weeks. Adjustments Claire had assured him were strategic, temporary. He had signed quickly, trusting her explanations. Now those transactions were flagged for review. Finance required clarification. The board demanded documentation. The timing couldn't be worse. Julian felt the first flicker of genuine unease. He dialed Claire. The call went to voicemail. He sent a message, no reply. He told himself she was busy, perhaps traveling, perhaps avoiding communication for caution. But doubt, once introduced, spreads quickly. He opened his laptop and scanned the transaction summaries more carefully. The numbers were significant. Substantial sums moved into holding accounts linked to Claire's business entity. He had believed they were temporary protections. Now they looked intentional, permanent. His phone rang again, the company's chief financial officer. The tone was not friendly. "We need you in the office immediately. There are serious concerns." Julian's irritation surged, masking deeper discomfort. He had built half the company's growth strategy. He wouldn't be cornered by internal audits. At headquarters, the atmosphere was tense. Conversations hushed as he stepped off the elevator. In the executive conference room, documents were spread across the table, transaction trails, compliance alerts. The CFO didn't waste time. "These transfers were executed without full board approval, and they connect directly to Claire Morrison." The name sounded harsher in a professional setting, stripped of romance. Julian defended the moves, strategy, confidentiality, positioning, but the room's skepticism was visible. A compliance officer mentioned potential regulatory scrutiny. A board member asked if personal relationships had influenced corporate decisions. The question hung in the air like a blade. For the first time, Julian felt heat rise beneath his collar. He realized something slowly, painfully. While he had been orchestrating the collapse of his marriage, he might have been orchestrating something far larger. He stared at the flagged accounts, and a dangerous possibility formed. If Claire had misled him, if the transfers were not strategic but self-serving, then he had compromised not only his marriage but his empire. And somewhere beneath the rising tension, another unsettling thought emerged. Alina had left without begging. That more than anything unsettled him most. He had assumed she was small because she let him feel large. Julian Carter had built his reputation on precision, but nothing in that conference room felt precise anymore. The air was thick with suspicion as board members sat rigidly around the long glass table, their faces lit by the cold glow of financial projections. Lines of red-marked irregular transfers, flagged accounts, questionable authorizations bearing Julian's digital signature. He stood at the head, explaining strategy in controlled tones, but the confidence he wore like armor was cracking. For the first time in years, he felt power slipping from his hands. The CFO spoke carefully, his words professional but sharp. The transactions linked to Claire Morrison had triggered automatic compliance alerts. Regulators were asking quiet questions. Julian insisted the transfers were temporary protective measures, but the explanations sounded thinner each time. A board member leaned back and asked the question no one wanted to voice. Were these decisions influenced by personal involvement? The room fell silent. Julian denied impropriety, but the word hung between them like smoke. He had believed he was in control of every angle. Claire had assured him everything was structured legally, intelligently. Now the documentation suggested otherwise. Several holding accounts were tied not only to her consulting firm, but to offshore subsidiaries Julian had never examined. He had trusted her. That realization burned hotter than the board's scrutiny. Trust, he was beginning to understand, could be more expensive than betrayal. Across the city, Alina sat in David's quiet apartment, holding Leo, unaware that Julian's professional foundation was fracturing. David had stepped into the kitchen, reviewing hospital emails on his tablet when his expression shifted subtly. He hesitated. "There's something you should know," he said gently. Earlier that day, during an administrative review, he had come across a confidential medical file linked to Claire Morrison. He hadn't searched for it. It surfaced during a compliance cross-check connected to corporate health insurance audits. But once he saw the name, he couldn't ignore it. Alina listened as David explained carefully, his tone measured and professional. The file confirmed permanent infertility due to previous medical complications. Claire could not conceive. The words settled slowly into Alina's awareness. Julian had spoken of building a real family with another woman, yet the biological possibility of that future did not exist. The irony was almost cruel. Alina felt no triumph. She felt clarity. Claire had not promised Julian love alone. She had promised him an illusion. And illusions, Alina now understood, were dangerous currency. Back at headquarters, Julian's phone vibrated with unanswered messages. Claire had stopped responding entirely. When he tried calling again, the line disconnected after a single ring. Panic pressed heavily against his ribs. If she had manipulated him into transferring assets, if the board uncovered personal motives behind corporate decisions, his career could collapse within weeks. Headlines would not distinguish between misjudgment and misconduct. Investors would not care about emotional entanglement. They would see risk, and risk demanded removal. By the time the board adjourned, Julian was placed on temporary suspension pending internal investigation. The word suspension echoed as he left the building under the watchful eyes of colleagues who no longer looked impressed. His empire, once seamless, now felt fragile. He sat alone in his car, replaying every conversation with Claire, every document he had signed without deeper inspection. Somewhere between arrogance and desire, he had underestimated the wrong woman. What Julian didn't know was that Alina was no longer operating from heartbreak alone. With knowledge came power. With power came strategy. And for the first time since she walked out of the penthouse, she understood that the collapse unfolding around him was not something she needed to orchestrate. It was something he had already set in motion himself. The courtroom didn't echo with shouting. It echoed with consequence. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Cook County Courthouse, illuminating polished benches and rigid faces. Alina Bennett sat quietly at one end, Leo sleeping in a carrier beside her, while David occupied the seat just behind her, offering quiet support. Her posture was straight, her gaze steady. Across the aisle, Julian Carter looked smaller than he ever had in his penthouse office. The months between her departure and this hearing had shifted everything. Julian's suspension had become termination. The internal investigation uncovered reckless authorizations and mismanaged transfers tied to Claire's shell companies. Regulators had stepped in. Shareholders panicked. The press moved quickly. Claire Morrison had vanished from Chicago, leaving behind unanswered calls and frozen accounts. Julian, once admired for control, now found himself at the mercy of legal counsel and public scrutiny. But here, the matter was not corporate. It was personal. The judge reviewed documents with measured attention while attorneys summarized timelines of abandonment, recorded statements, financial instability. Julian's lawyer tried to soften the narrative, framing him as a stressed executive overwhelmed by pressure. But evidence was stubborn. Text messages were presented, voicemail transcripts, testimony from the hospital nurse who remembered his absence. Even the board suspension letter became relevant, not as punishment but as proof of instability. Throughout it all, Elena remained calm. She didn't dramatize. She didn't exaggerate. She spoke only when addressed, her voice controlled and clear. When the judge asked why she had left the marital home so soon after childbirth, Elena's answer was simple. She refused to raise her son in a house where love was conditional and loyalty negotiable. The room fell quiet at the precision of her words. Julian shifted in his seat, recognizing too late that the woman he once dismissed as dependent now spoke with quiet authority. There was no bitterness in her tone, only resolve. She didn't seek revenge. She sought protection. After careful deliberation, the court granted primary custody of Leo to Elena with supervised visitation for Julian, pending further review of his legal and financial circumstances. The gavel struck once, firm and final. Julian closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the outcome. For a man who once believed he controlled every narrative, the finality was jarring. He had lost far more than position. He had lost proximity to the only part of his life that might have redeemed him. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited, but Elena declined to speak. She shielded Leo from the flashes and walked past reporters without pausing. David followed at a respectful distance. The autumn air felt crisp and clean as she stepped onto the sidewalk, a subtle contrast to the tension left behind. Chicago moved around her with steady rhythm, traffic flowing, strangers passing, life continuing without regard for scandal or status. For the first time in months, her breathing felt completely even. Later that afternoon, she walked through Millennium Park with Leo bundled safely against her chest. The trees were turning shades of amber and gold, leaves drifting lazily across the pavement. David joined her, hands tucked into his coat pockets. He didn't rush conversation. He walked beside her in silence, matching her pace. Eventually, he spoke gently, telling her that whatever future she chose, she wouldn't have to choose it alone. Elena looked down at her son, then out at the open sky above the city skyline. She had once believed her world was built from glass towers and shared last names. Now she understood it was built from choices. Julian had chosen ambition over loyalty, illusion over truth. She had chosen dignity. She had not walked away empty. She had walked away free. As the wind lifted strands of her hair and Leo stirred softly against her heart, Elena realized something quietly transformative. Stories like hers are more than dramatic narratives. They reveal a psychological truth. Betrayal rarely destroys a person in the moment it happens. What truly reshapes a life is the decision that follows. Elena's turning point wasn't the betrayal itself, but the moment she stopped accepting a version of love built on control and silence. In behavioral psychology, this is called reclaiming personal agency, the ability to redefine your path even after emotional collapse. Her story reminds us that dignity is often quiet, but it is also powerful. If this journey resonated with you, take a second to support the channel by liking this video and subscribing to Winds of Thought. Your support helps us keep sharing meaningful stories that explore courage, healing, and self-worth. And before you go, leave a short comment below with 2 simple words that capture the heart of this story.